Hello. This video reviews our first unit's introductory lecture. Our first unit is on the Anglo-Saxon age. Now, our textbook also includes a thematic element to every unit, so not all the works of literature that are found in our textbook in a unit are actually from that particular historical period. Most of the leading works are from that period. So we combine kind of a chronological study of British history and literature with a thematic study of whatever the particular theme the editors picked out. Well, in this one it's very appropriate. For the Anglo-Saxon age, our theme is the theme of the hero. But it's very important in British Lit especially to know what's going on historically and how the literature mirrors the attitudes of the people during that time. So I like to start out with historical lecture, and our textbook actually starts out with historical material first before it gets to the literature. So let's take a look at a few things that happened during this time period. First, let's go way back. The first people in Britain were nomadic hunters who were followed around 3500 BC by Celtic farmers. Iron Age Britain, which we identify as around 1000 BC, saw metalworking, wheeled vehicles, and horsemanship. Julius Caesar landed his troops around 55 BC, but the Romans really did not set up a permanent presence until AD 43 under the Emperor Claudius. The Iceni king Prasutagus and his queen Boudica placed themselves under Claudius's rule. In AD 60, however, with the Emperor Nero in charge, the Britain lands were conquered. Prasutagus was killed, and Boudica took revenge by becoming the first true war chief of all Britain. And she began burning Roman British towns, including Londinium, which we call London. The well-trained Romans eventually, though, won the war. By the year 100, the Romans had built more towns and roads, and the remaining Britons who were left became slaves or they married into Roman families, thus giving their descendants Roman citizenship. By 410, though, Rome itself was being invaded, and most of the soldiers returned to the continent to fight. After the Romans left, it was open season on Britain. Picts from the Northlands, in what we would call Scotland, and Scots from the west, what we would call Ireland, invaded. Germanic tribes like the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons invaded Britain around 449. In the 500s, a Briton-Celtic warlord named Riothamus, which translates as great leader, fought the Saxons in a series of battles. This leader may have been the actual basis for the King Arthur legend. His Roman name was Artorius, which of course in English is Arthur. In the 500s and the 600s, though, the Anglo-Saxons must have gotten their act together. Rather than fighting each other, they decided to band together into a group of 7 little kingdoms, what you and I would call counties, and they were known as the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, or Rule of 7. They chose Egbert as their first high king. He was the grandfather of a much more famous Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred the Great. And by this screen right here, you don't have to have these memorized, but you can kind of tell where their counties were. Kent and Wessex, Wessex down below in the Southlands, Essex over there on the east side, Northumbria up there north by Scotland, Mercia in the middle of the country, so you can kind of tell by their names where they were. Well, all primitive peoples go through the same social evolution, doesn't matter what continent they came from. First, the oldest family member is the leader. When several relatives move in, the clan unit is established. When the clans join together, the tribal unit is formed. It's at the tribal unit we start having laws. When the tribes cooperate, the county kingdom develops. If several county kingdoms can unite, then a true kingdom is created with a high king chosen because of his military reputation. From the continent, the Anglo-Saxons had brought with them legends of the Norse gods. Odin, or Woden, was their chief god. His son Thor, or Thunor, was in charge of the weather. Tu, or Tyr, was the god of conflict and war. Freya, or Frigga, was the goddess of the home. And they also believed in a spirit of fate that even controlled all the other gods. And her name was Weird. And that's where we get our word weird today. And if you take a look at the names, our days of the week, many of them are named after these Norse gods. Monday is named after the moon. That's a Roman name. Sunday is named after the sun. Again, Roman. Saturday is named after Saturn, Roman. But the others are Norse. Tuesday for Tew, the war goddess. The god of war, rather. Wednesday for Woden, the chief god. Woden's Day, Wednesday. That's why Wednesday has that D in there we don't pronounce. Thursday is Thor's Day. And then Friday was named after Freya or Frigga. So even though the old beliefs are gone, some traces of their language still exist in our language. Well, you notice this little picture here of Thor's hammer. His hammer, of course, was Mjolnir. And it was a magic hammer. Thor could create thunder and lightning with a hammer. He could fly through the air with a hammer. Some of us are familiar with the Marvel movies. And so that's the hammer of Thor right there. Well, many of the warriors used to wear these little amulets of Thor around their neck. So when they were Christianized, here came St. Augustine in 597, meeting King Ethelbert of Kent in the King's Hall. And here we have a typical King's Hall where the king and his family would be seated behind a big table. Along the benches on the side, his trusted advisors, the comitatus, literally the eaters with the king, would sit. Big fire in the middle, guard dogs all around. And a guest would enter from the far end. So when Augustine showed up in 597 to preach to King Ethelbert, this is probably the situation he found. He didn't try to change the people overnight. He tried to find some similarities with the beliefs they already had. He said, you believe in an all-father God? And they said, yes, Woden. He said, well, we call him Jehovah. You believe he has a strong young son who fights evil? Thor. Well, we call him Jesus. He tried to find some similarities. He found out these people believed in an afterlife, so he told them about heaven. They believed in a place of punishment, so he told them about hell. And so he tried to find some similarities. Well, if we go back up, he saw the warriors all had these thorns, these Thor's hammers around their neck. And so he said, that's actually a sign of the Son of God, isn't it? They said, yes. He said, well, let me show you what it's supposed to be. And he added a little piece of metal at the bottom, and before you knew it, he had the warriors wearing crosses into battle. So he was pretty smart. King Ethelbert decided that it wasn't a big contradiction from what he already believed in, and so he gave Augustine permission to bring in more priests and to establish chapels and churches around the country. Beowulf is our longest important work left to us from the Anglo-Saxon period. Later on, the Vikings invaded Anglo-Saxon England and burned many of the monastery libraries that contain the old stories. So we have relatively very few pieces of literature from this time period compared to other time periods. We don't know who Beowulf was. He may have been a real person, and legends then grew up around him. Lived around the same time as the King Arthur from legend also lived. So he was probably born, if he really was a person, around the late 400s, early 500s, and gained a big reputation as a warrior when he was still a teenager. Now, the way it comes across to us in our stories, he fought monsters and prevailed. Later on, Beowulf, as an old man, fought a dragon in the story. But we know by the 600s there was a story circulated of some brave warrior called Beowulf. A poem was written about him in the 700s to the 800s, but we do not have a copy of it. We simply have a reference that it existed. The Beowulf we have in our textbook, the oldest copy anybody's ever found, is from around the year 1000, but most people think it was not changed too much from that 700s to 800s version. But it was not translated into modern English until the 1800s, so it took a long time for us to be able to read our longest work in English. Now, it's not the English that you and I speak. It's Old English. It's Anglo-Saxon. It's before the Norman French invaded. That's Old English. So it's very different. It's like a foreign language to us. The poetry is very complex. It contains very strong rhythm but no rhyme. Literary devices common to their poetry are kinning, which is a compound metaphor like saying whale road instead of ocean. They also liked understatement, like little mini riddles they had to work out to figure out what's going on. Britain produced many educated churchmen, including the Venerable Bede, who wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, sometimes called a history of the English church and people. He wrote it in 731, and of course, as an educated Catholic churchman, he wrote in Latin, although he was a Saxon himself. The monasteries became the first schools in England, since the monks really were the only literate people, and the nobles were encouraged to send their their youngest sons to school to learn how to read and write, so they could come back and work for their older brothers. King Egbert's grandson was the most famous of the Saxon kings, Alfred the Great, born in 849. Alfred was the educated member of the family because he was the baby in the family. Nobody ever thought he would rule. But his father died, and then one brother after the other died, and Alfred was made king at age 21. He had to deal with the Viking problem. But eventually too many Vikings began to invade, these Danes, these men from Norway and Sweden who were coming down to England, and they began to attack that lower county, Wessex, that was his capital. Alfred's forces eventually trapped the Viking leader Guthrum's forces in a swamp, and eventually Guthrum had to surrender. In 886, Alfred awarded the Vikings the eastern part of England, and they were, of course, already there in the eastern part of England. He was basically giving them what they already controlled, but they made it official, known as the Danelaw, as long as they acknowledged that Alfred was their high king. All of his experiences give him the title of Alfred the Great, such as building new towns and forts and strengthening London itself. He encouraged the nobles to send all their sons, not just the youngest sons, to the monastery schools. He oversaw the translating of many books himself into Anglo-Saxon from Latin and Greek and Hebrew. He initiated the first history of England actually written in English, a series of chronicles that we collectively call the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And of course, our time period ends in 1066, when the Norman French invade and our language goes through its next evolution into what we call Middle English.